Well, I'm back in the hot tub, and I wanted to sort of circle the wagons because in the last episode, I mentioned that conservatives often suffer from a problem of being inarticulate. They use a lot of muddy language. Conservative thought is riddled with language that doesn't really mean anything. It's indistinguishable from gibberish or white noise. It's babble, essentially. Words like spirits or soul or ghosts or whatever. Pick a word that doesn't really mean anything, even if it has a definition, even if we use it as if it means something. These are words that have never been demonstrated to have any real meaning. So a ghost isn't really a thing. In the dictionary, it might say it's a soul of a dead human being come back as an apparition. But that's not something that's ever been demonstrated. That's just a concept. Conservative rhetoric and conservative language is riddled with these kinds of words. And as a progressive and somebody who talks with conservatives here in the hot tub and decodes the way they think and what they say, I often hear inarticulate conservatives trying to explain things to me. And in this episode, I'm going to talk to you about one of my favorite inarticulate conservatives. He has exactly 3 words that he uses. He's the 3-word wonder. He also has a phrase that he uses all the time if he's ever questioned on anything. Now, he uses these words, these 3 words, usually to explain to me the different things that he likes. So, if he saw a movie that he likes, he says it's dark. And if he heard a song or a new band that he likes, he says they're aggressive. And everything else, like any book he's read or something that's not dark or aggressive, is fascinating. Now, I know what he means. Dark, aggressive, fascinating. But these words don't really explain anything about the movie he likes or the music that he listens to or the documentary he saw on Netflix. And if I do ask him to explain himself, he can't. I mean, he literally cannot. He just goes back to those 3 words. If I push back on anything he says, he has this catchphrase that he loves to use. He says, well, I just call it like I see it. As if your common sense can determine right from wrong, good from evil, true from untrue. This is incredibly conservative. When people try to tell you, I just call it like I see it, more often than not, they've just said something horrible, like something racist or sexist, and then you say, are you sure? That doesn't sound right to me. That kind of sounds racist. And then they say, I just call it like I see it. Like it's justified because they came to their conclusion based on their one experience. This is incredibly conservative. It's conservative that you can have an experience and then assume that all people are like this. So there I am, sitting in the hot tub. And the 3-word wonder walks in. And he gets in and he sort of stretches and grunts and groans a little bit. And then he says to me, hey, I was reading this book. It would be right up your alley. It was fascinating. And I said, oh, okay. Well, tell me about it. And he said, well, there's this one part in particular that I really liked. He said, it really grasped me. That's what he said. It grasped me. He went on to say, so he starts off by saying that life is basically DNA and RNA. That's the breakdown of molecules. That's at the molecular level, and that's what life is. So the way that it works is that RNA is the single strand and DNA is the double strand. And, within that, there are molecules that are universal. And by universal, I mean they are from our universe. And they came together and they do certain things. And I said, oh, okay. Universal molecules that come from our universe. Okay, that makes sense. I was trying to humor him a little. I didn't. Obviously, this is gibberish. This is just white noise babble, right? This is the kind of thing of, you have a lot of patience with a child, or maybe somebody who, has real problems speaking. Maybe they're trying to speak a second language or something like that. It's not their native tongue. But this is a grown man sitting in a hot tub trying to turn me on to this book he read that was fascinating. And so far, he hasn't made one point, not one lick of sense. But I say, okay, sure, okay. So the DNA is a molecule and RNA is a molecule. And they arise naturally in the universe. That's right. And he went on from there. And he said, well, for example, we have molecules in our DNA and in our RNA that are the same as fire. And I paused for a second and I said, we have what? I said, we have molecules that are the same as fire. And he went, yeah. Well, yeah, think about it. Despite how many times a fire gets started, it will never save its existence. And I said, what do you mean save its existence? And he said, well, a fire lights and it burns, but it always burns out. That's just the way it is. And I said, okay. He said, yeah, but on the other hand, DNA and RNA contain information, and that information changes due to environmental pressures. And I thought, okay, I don't love that word information. That's usually a red flag. Like, okay, now I'm talking to a creationist, right? Somebody who believes that Jesus is the Son of God and that it was a good idea that he got murdered so that you can go to heaven, which is very clearly not a good idea. But I said, okay, all right, where are we going here? He said, well, the information, it transfers over and then does its best to adapt. He went on to say, even with the molecular things, the same things that are happening with fire, the DNA and the RNA are able to adapt. So because of DNA and RNA, life is able to adapt to the pressure of its surroundings. When it's active, of course, but that's life. And I paused for a second because I chuckled because the way he said that's life. That's life. It sounded like it was so deep, like he had just said something. I mean, we hit rock bottom there. This was the depths of the ocean, right? So this white noise babble that he just fumbled through to explain to me something, I don't know what. The punchline is that's life. So here's, I guess, him trying to explain to me what life is. So I said to him, okay, so the book you're reading talks about life. It talks about DNA and I guess fire. And this is some sort of metaphor for life? Because I know that life has almost nothing to do with whatever this babble was he was saying. I mean, we have a biological definition of life. If I say that's life, the stuff I say before it is the biological definition of life. I said, oh, well, the book you're reading, it's about life, huh? Okay. And fire? And he got excited. He was like, yeah, man. And when it's broken down to that level, for me, it makes me go, wow, yeah, that makes sense. And I paused for a second and I kind of looked at him queerly and I said, so that makes sense to you, what you just said? And he said, yeah. I mean, when you break it down like philosophically, because, when you hear sometimes somebody asking the question like, well, what is life and what does it all mean? And when somebody asks me that question, I think, well, I mean, it's just DNA and RNA and we're all just adapting. And I said, oh, okay, so like you read this book or whatever, and then that's now, you've incorporated that into your answer of like, what's life? What's the meaning of life? And he just said, yeah, like on all levels, that's what's going on. This code, this information is just trying to keep going. It's just trying to keep going. And I had to pause here for a second again and kind of chuckle. And I'm not trying to be rude to him, but he's saying so little and he's using so many words. And one of the big giveaways here is just him repeating himself and these sort of mic drop moments, it's just trying to go on. And then he repeats himself. It's just trying to go on. Like he said something so profound that he has to say it twice to make sure he gets the point across. And I'm watching him and I'm thinking, wow, he's really into this. It's kind of like when you see, somebody who's really into a new band or something and they're telling you about it and they have this look in their eye and they're just talking in such a way that like their mind is just perpetually blown. And so here he is thinking about something in a book he read somewhere and he's trying to explain it to me. And it's been going on now for, 15 minutes and he hasn't made one word of sense. And it gets worse from there. So after this mic drop moment, I sort of said, oh, okay. And so, what has that meant for you? And he said, well, I find that like in the case of religion, when it comes to religion, I find that, that's not necessarily, and he sort of paused and he was grunting a little bit because I think he was worried about bad-mouthing religion in the midst of, he doesn't know my religious views, so he wasn't sure if he was going to offend me or whatever, but he hemmed and hawed a little bit and he said, yeah, I mean, when it comes to religion, that's not like front and center. Like they're not saying that that's what life is. And then also too, when you die, you get either rewarded or you'll get punished. And that just completely disregards, the reality of DNA and RNA. and what that's doing, And this was one of those where he's looking to me to like validate or to encourage him to continue. And I couldn't recreate the look that was on my face, but just utter confusion is the best way I can describe it. At this point now, I had no fucking idea what he was talking about. I smiled back at him and he continued, and he went on with kind of a furrowed brow. He said, like when you die, you're not going to be reincarnated, but this DNA and this RNA can be transferred to the next generation, and it's like adapting and changing, depending on the environment. And, this obviously, comes down to Darwinism. And I paused for a second and I said, Darwinism? Because most of the time when a conservative talks about Darwinism, they're including a lot of baggage in that language. And he said, yeah, there's all these amazing things happening at the smallest level. And, like this information, it doesn't want to fail. It just keeps wanting to adapt. And I think that there's value in that. And I paused for a second and I thought, okay, well, this conversation is now going in a slightly different direction than I anticipated. I thought, okay, well, here now we have a conservative who has read a book and they got something from the book, and he's trying to explain to me how this has sort of opened his eyes in some sense to Darwinian evolution. And he's trying to sort of express to me that he gets it and that there's value in this way of thinking. And so I immediately became excited for him. And I said, oh, right on. Okay. So you used to have sort of this religious idea of value in life, and now you are finding value in evolution and genetics and cladistics and morphology. And he looked at me kind of confused and he goes, yeah, I guess. Yeah, sort of. So he went on to say, if religion would just try to incorporate this in such a way so that they're not, disrespecting science, I think that would be good. And I said, yeah, I guess that would be good. Now, in my mind, I'm thinking about all the different ways that they already do this. Like the word disrespect is poorly used there, but Aristotle's entire life after death was religious people trying to incorporate what he considered science at the time, his philosophy, into religious thought. So Thomas Aquinas, and there are others, but Thomas Aquinas is famous for modernizing Catholicism by incorporating Aristotle. I mean, every time religion and religious groups tries to do what this guy is suggesting, the three-word wonder, they fail. And it's just this bizarre perversion of science and reason and skepticism and so on. But he was so excited and it was interesting. And so I prodded and poked a little bit now that he was done. It seemed like there was a pause in the conversation. And so I asked him a question. I said, earlier you said that life is like fire. I said, is that literal or were you just being figurative? And he responded with, no. On like a molecular level, we have the same thing as fire. Like the same ingredients that are in fire are in us. And I was confused by this, obviously, because that makes no sense. And I looked at him and he could tell I was confused. And so he went on. He said, well, now think about this. He goes, take like a fire, like a forest fire. All of them will start and then eventually burn out. And he goes, every year we have forest fires, and it's not like each new fire learns from the last fire. So the fire doesn't learn from the other fire. He said, fire just doesn't have that capability. It doesn't have DNA. He said, it has the same molecules, but it doesn't have DNA, and it doesn't have RNA. And I said, yeah, okay. Trying to see if there was a way for him to meander into a point or into some coherent thought. And he went on to say, yeah, I mean, fire doesn't have the DNA and the RNA, so it doesn't transfer and transmit the information. But that's why I use that example, because the fire, every time it gets to water, it goes out. But that's just a clean way to think about it. That's just a clear, clean example. And so I said, oh, okay. Now I don't know what he's trying to say at all. Like he's completely lost me and lost the thread of conversation. And so then I asked him, I said, okay, so the fire goes to, I don't know, a body of water or something, or it encounters water, and you're saying it's never able to conquer water. Like, I didn't know what to say at this point. And he goes, yeah, like fire is never going to encounter water and then say like, hey, let's build a boat, or let's build a bridge or a dock, right? It's never going to figure anything out. And he went on to say, yeah, I mean, how like, plants or whatever, they grow and respond to and adapt to their environment. And he said, fire never does that because it doesn't have a consciousness. And I looked at him and I said, okay. And by the way, just to remind everybody, all I asked is this use of fire, you saying fire has the same stuff in it. Was that literal or figurative? And he says, no, it's literal. And then this is now he's gone down this route. He's taking me down this path of now, almost entirely nonsense and gibberish. At the end of this explanation or this answer to my question, he did one of my favorite things, and he looked at me with a really uncertain look on his face, and in this tone that you hear a lot from people like this, and this phrase, I love this phrase. He goes, "Does that make sense?" It's like a pleading with me. Please say that I'm making sense. And that brings up an interesting point. It seems to me, in my experiences with folks like this, that these poor thinkers and poor, inarticulate conservative types, there's still an aspect of humanity here. They still want to be understood. They still want to be supported and nurtured in their thinking, even if it's poor thinking, even if they have failed to make any sense whatsoever. And I'm guilty of this sometimes. Sometimes I say, does that make sense to people after I've explained something or tried to explain something? It's just, there's a big difference between somebody who knows what they're talking about and is explaining it in an intelligible way, somebody who's articulate, and somebody who is completely inarticulate and has just droned on for 20 minutes, spewing out gibberish and white noise. The way that question's delivered, does that make sense? That's how I would deliver it. As somebody if I was trying to describe life and I was talking about metabolism and getting into what it is that metabolism is and how it happens and why that's part of life, hopefully I would be articulate and I would say, does that make sense? And I'm checking in, and maybe they would say yes or no or whatever. But the tone that he uses is so sad and pathetic. Does that make sense? He's almost questioning himself. I think I make sense. And another phrase that a lot of these guys use is, if that makes any sense. They'll say something that makes no sense, and then they'll say, if that makes any sense, I don't know. If that makes any sense at all. And you're like, well, no, not really. And in response to his sad question, does that make sense? I had to be kind of frank with him, and I said, well, kind of. I said, I don't understand what you're saying, though, when you say that fire is like life. They're not the same thing. Fire is a plasma, and it doesn't have any components of life. It doesn't do any of the same things that life does. And ultimately, I just said, I'm confused why you're saying that fire is like life still. And so after I posed that question, he said, well, the fire doesn't have the DNA and the RNA, right? Like if you were to visualize it, it doesn't have those two elements. And I said, sure, right? And he said, but the parts in between the DNA, like the bars that connect the two strands, like those molecular elements. And I said, yeah, DNA is a molecule. And he responded with, yeah, but inside the DNA, there's like a code, the next level down from the molecule. So I just reiterated, I said, yeah, DNA is a molecule. And then he did the cutest thing. It was so sweet. He tried to break it down for me as if I was stupid. He saw my confusion in what he was trying to explain to me, and he became professorial and nurturing. And here's what he said. He goes, all right, well, think about it like this. Like, let's say you have, on one side you have A, and on the other side you have B. And then there's the in-between part, the bar that connects the A and the B. And the A and the B, they're attached, through the sugar. And he said, the fire, it can have those elements, the A and the B and, the whatever. But that middle part, the binding, the fire has the A and the B, or it can have the A and the B, but it doesn't have the binding. And he went on and he said, you see, it's that binding that allows for the opportunity of the thing to adapt, through pressure. And then he got really, really sweet. And he said, it's because it's just that, I don't exactly know why, but that's how it adapts. And that might be the first honest thing he said in this entire conversation. He said, I don't know. And really, the entirety of this conversation could have been summed up with just, I don't know. I read a book. It had some interesting passages in it that related fire to life and DNA. And I don't know. I don't know what it was trying to say. I don't get it, but that's what he should have said. But instead, he treated me to 20 minutes of a dissertation that ended in him patronizing me, trying to explain it to me like I'm an idiot because I fail to understand this white noise gibberish babble. Now, being the kind of person I am and not wanting to really back down from a conversation, I didn't change the subject, but I moved on to another point. I said, okay, well, that's interesting. And then I said, I should have said, that's fascinating. But I said, that brings me to my next question. I said, you mentioned the word information. And I said, that word is kind of a loaded word. Information is usually used by fundamentalist Christians and, people that are in the intelligent design movement and so on. And so that word interests me. And right away he said, he perked up and he said, yeah, it interests me too. Like we're on to something now, right? Like after all this that he's been saying to me, we're finally getting to the meat of it, It was cute the way he said it. But I asked him, I said, is this intelligent design that you're talking about? Like, I didn't know what book he was reading, and clearly he didn't understand it. And so I was starting to try to figure out, okay, what is this source material? And here's what he said. He said, well, that's not what the book's about. This was just one part of the book. And I said, oh. And I said, well, what's the name of the book? And he couldn't remember. And I said, okay. I said, well, who's the author? And he goes, I don't know the guy's name. And I said, okay. And I said, maybe you could send it to me, another time after you think about it or after you look it up or whatever. And he goes, yeah, that's cool. So we exchanged numbers and he texted me the book. And he didn't know where the passage was that he was referring to in the book, but I did some research. Here's the quote from the book. So brace yourself, okay? This is probably going to be underwhelming. Quote, at one time we thought that the way life came together was almost completely random, only needing an energy gradient to get going. But as we've moved into the information age, we've come to realize that life is more about information than energy. Fire has most of the characteristics of life. It eats, it grows, it reproduces. But fire retains no information. It doesn't learn. It doesn't adapt. The 5 millionth fire started by lightning will behave just like the first. But the 500th bacterial division will not be like the first one, especially if there is environmental pressure. That's DNA and RNA. That's life. Unquote. Wow. So some random quote from a random book. Now, I've actually since read that book. It's not a bad book. It's a pretty good book. It has nothing to do with life. The author is not a biologist or anything like that. And this is actually a fake quote that the author conjured up. This is just one of those small little blurps that authors put in their books sometimes that they then build on in the chapter that follows. This is one of those quotes that just sort of gets you thinking or is meant to just sort of get your brain working so that they can deliver a message to you in the next chapter. Now, this quote's actually specifically outdated. I mean, it's not only outdated in what it's saying, and it doesn't, because for instance, fire does not have most of the characteristics of life. It doesn't eat, it doesn't grow, and it doesn't reproduce. This is an apples to oranges comparison. It can be said to eat, but it doesn't literally eat. I literally eat. I'm a Homo sapiens. It doesn't literally grow. It doesn't have cell division. It doesn't metabolize. It doesn't doesn't do any of the things that life does, and it doesn't reproduce. You could use other words and say the same thing. You could say it spreads, it consumes, it multiplies. I mean, you could use words that are similar to these. And again, this is figurative. This isn't an actual classification, scientific classification of fire, and that classification is very, very similar to biological life. They have almost nothing to do with one another. It's just interesting to me that an inarticulate, uneducated conservative reads an interesting book that has just this sort of throwaway passage that is only very loosely based on reality and science, and is actually a fake quote that was supposedly was propped up as if it was real, but for the purpose of the book, it makes sense. This has now sparked this flurry of brain activity in this inarticulate conservative, and he's just desperately trying to express his thoughts and feelings and trying to make sense of what he's now thinking. I guess in some sense that's good, at least he's sort of thinking, but listen to the quality of his thought. There is no syllogistic logic at all in what he's saying. He's not connecting any dots. He's not even making any sense. I have to do most of the work as the listener to assume that I know what he's saying. And that's a huge red flag. And it's very common when you're talking to conservative people that they're going to say muddy, dirty, inarticulate language, and then you have to sort of assume you understand what they mean. And just to be clear, this is a regular person. This isn't like Forrest Gump. He's not like incapable of learning. He's not mentally challenged in any way. There's no psychological disorder or physiological disorder or neurological disorder. There's nothing we could take him to a doctor to and say, what's wrong with this person? Why can't he communicate effectively? He's just a regular guy, but he is completely incapable of demonstrating, first of all, that he understands the material he's trying to convey. And what he is demonstrating is that he is just an ignoramus, and he's just trying to piece things together. This reminds me of somebody I used to work with who I sent a video to, and it was a video of like a 8th grade demonstration of gravity. They take a big sheet of rubber and they stretch it over, like imagine a big 5 or 6 foot in diameter steel hula hoop that's on legs, and they stretch this rubber over it and secure it with clamps, and then they put a 5-pound weight in the middle and it makes what looks like a funnel. And then they throw ball bearings into this rubber funnel and they orbit. They circle around and around and around, and they bang into each other, and eventually it approximates a model of like a solar system where that big 5-pound weight in the middle is the sun or whatever the gravitational body is at the center of the system. And those little ball bearings are planets. And sometimes they can even make the ball bearings orbit each other. It's really great stuff. Like you look at that and you think, okay, there's a wonderful 2D model of what's happening in our solar system, what happens in space. And in this demonstration, the teacher that was doing the demonstration to the 8th graders, he threw out of his left hand, he threw a handful of ball bearings in one direction, and in his right hand, he threw a handful of ball bearings in the other direction. And so we have 2 different groups of ball bearings orbiting in the rubber in different directions. And it doesn't matter which way these objects start moving or orbiting in the solar system, eventually they'll all cancel each other out and they'll all be orbiting in the same direction. He did this over and over and over again. And every time, what remained was maybe 4 or 5 ball bearings orbiting in the same direction. That was the demonstration. That was what you would get out of this if you were an intellectual and somebody who was scientifically oriented and you were mentally competent. But this guy that I sent to at work, he saw this and he came up to me and said, I saw that video. That was really cool. He said, it got me thinking, what if when there was the Big Bang, what if instead of 1 bang, there were 2 bangs? And I said, what? He goes, yeah. Like in that video, the guy threw 2 handfuls of ball bearings. What if that's how the Big Bang happened? It was 2 bangs. And they sort of counteracted each other out. And I said, well, that video had nothing to do with the Big Bang. That was just solar system formation. It was just a basic, really dumbed down demonstration of how gravity works in a solar system and how solar systems form. And you can just get some of the basics. I said, that had nothing to do with the Big Bang. And he goes, well, why can't I be right? Why can't it be what I'm saying? And I said, go read about the Big Bang. That's a different website. That's a different video. There's a totally different demonstration for that. And it's done in a particle collider or something like that. And he goes, but I think there were two bangs. And this interaction just reminded me of that. It's just an ignoramus, somebody who is so disconnected from reality and from scientific thought and such a poor thinker, doesn't engage skeptically. Not that they couldn't. They could be a powerful thinker. They could be somebody who's logically sound, but they're not. And they're not because they don't ever take the time to get past that first little blurb. They read, a 35-word blurb in a book, and then they think they figured out biology and DNA. And all of a sudden, the light flickers on dimly, and they've made sense of something. Or in the case of the guy from work, he saw one video, it was probably 2 minutes long, and now he's figured out the cosmos and the beginnings of the universe. This is I call this conservative thought because it falls in this category of thought where people think they get to decide and they are the one that has this massive brainstorm that results in truth. And they say things like, well, it makes sense to me, or in the case of the guy at work, well, why can't I be right? What these conservatives fail to recognize is that wild explosions of thought and inspiration, the type that we would see with like Newton and Einstein, first of all, only happen in very rare cases. It's not that you couldn't be inspired and that you couldn't be flooded with thoughts and feelings and emotions and so on, but without the proper training, without the proper background, without the proper knowledge, pre-knowledge, most of what your thoughts are going to be, you're not going to be able to make sense of them. That's why it's so important to be educated, thoroughly educated in the sciences. It's so that when you do get a flurry of inspiration, you're able to tie it into reality in some way. But just because you have a flurry of inspiration and you're trying to tie it into reality the way that this guy was in the hot tub, that doesn't mean that it's actually true. As a scientist and as part of the scientific method, you actually have to go through all the process then of demonstrating that your flurry of inspiration is accurate. That's what Einstein did for like the rest of his life after he had his theory of relativity. And I say theory, that was demonstrated to be a theory only after years and years and years of mathematics and visual demonstrations, actual observations of space-time. At the time that Einstein thought of it, it wasn't the theory of relativity, it was the idea of relativity, the hypothesis that he then had to formulate so that he could test it and hopefully it would survive peer review. In the case of Einstein, it did. In the case of my friend in the hot tub, he couldn't even come up with a coherent thought. Now, ideally, somebody like this fella in the hot tub, the three-word wonder, he reads this passage, preferably this would spark an inspiration into him where he would go and read about DNA and RNA and abiogenesis and chemistry and biology and zoology and maybe some physics. And the difference between information and DNA. There's a big difference between those things. But sadly, because he's conservative, this is probably as far as it's going to go. He's made up his mind and his conclusions, however inarticulately he expressed them to me in the hot tub, are his conclusion. That's what he now believes. That's what he now thinks. And what's so interesting about this is he thinks what he's saying is scientific. He thinks he's intelligent. So I'll leave you in this episode at that. Thank you very much for listening.